Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Jane Williams, Professor Emeritus at Swansea University in Wales of the United Kingdom, and longtime children's rights scholar and activist. In this episode, Jane discusses the origins of her interest in human rights issues, notably those impacting children, how her legal training influenced her work on children's rights, the development of the Wales Children's Parliament, her scholarship on the process of devolution and its implications for children's rights in the UK, recommendations for strategies to advance children's rights, how governments can improve their treatment of child migrants, the effectiveness of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, notably through the work of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, an individual she views as her most influential role model, a key quote that effectively summarizes the importance of human rights for Jane, and what she views as a critical recommendation for advancing the rights of children worldwide. Well, it's indeed my pleasure to be speaking today with Jane Williams, who is residing in Wales and just told me that it's cloudy around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Is that right, Jane?
That's about right. Yep.
Okay. So, Jane, tell us first how you became interested in human rights issues and later on in human rights education.
Yeah, it feels like a lifelong interest now, but it isn't quite. I guess as an adolescent, I'd had a fairly comfortable childhood and volunteered via the school, I think, to support a children's play club on a Saturday afternoon in what I suppose we'd now call a multiply deprived area of the city where I grew up, which is Nottingham in the East Midlands in England. And this was the first time that I encountered real poverty. I hadn't really seen it. I had no idea that there were children whose lives were so limited by poverty. And associated with that were a couple of actually, I think, postgraduate students who were living in the area and were heavily involved with tenants association work. A lot of these children lived in slum accommodation with very, very few facilities, outside toilets, all the rest of it, or it was sort of 19th century slum accommodation. And this tenants association was taking on the landlords and trying to, make some cases. So I became cross about inequality as an adolescent. And I think that is definitely what interested me in the law in the first place, and which fueled in due course my interest in and passion for children's rights.
So when you talk about the idea of poverty, I think for many people, not only in the United States, but elsewhere, that's sort of a broad term. But how did you see it affecting children specifically?
In the clothes that they wore and the clothes that they didn't have, in the limitation of their experiences in life. For example, maybe never having gone off their block or very far off their block, in 5, 6, 7, 8 years of existence. There was an occasion when we organised to take these children out to the country, and literally there were some kids who'd never been in a field and got very excited about a stick or a tree or something like that. So multiple disadvantage and all within a couple of miles of where I was living in a pleasant suburb of that same city. It's the inequality that was so striking, as well as the raw experience of poverty itself. So parents who might be working, parents who might not be working through disability or whatever, but just very, very low income, totally different sorts of lives. Obviously, totally different life chances emanating from those experiences and those conditions.
So you had mentioned in your first response that you eventually became interested in the law and that this had been a defining experience for you to move in that direction. So what did you study in the law that related to human rights, and how did it influence your pursuit of children's rights?
Yeah, interestingly, when I was a law student at Cambridge between 75 and 78, and in those days there was no course on human rights. There was actually no undergraduate course even on European Union law, despite the fact that the UK had joined the what is now called the European Union in 1972. We did study Roman law. We did study all sorts of not quite so relevant contemporary things. In my third year, I had the opportunity to write a dissertation, and I selected the subject of child abuse and childcare and the law. And I researched the development of childcare law in England and Wales. And I did a little bit of field work as well, looking into the emerging practices around multidisciplinary case conferences. These were in the days when actually we weren't so much talking about child abuse as the battered baby syndrome, something which emerged from research in the United States, I believe, academic called Kemp and others. So that was in 1978. Now, I was not aware at the time of the Polish proposal at the United Nations for a Convention on the Rights of the Child. I wasn't aware of human rights conventions either, but I'm proud to say that I ended my dissertation. Well, I'm not proud of the ignorance that I had of human rights at the time, but having studied the law and having studied the serious case reports, the inquiries into deaths of children who hadn't been adequately supported in the community or children in care, I concluded that what was needed was a system which was based on the rights of the child rather than focusing on the adults in the room and the adults in the situation. It was only much later that I realized that was coinciding with the beginning of an international debate, which was to take place over 10 years and leading to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So in private practice as a barrister, when I qualified to do that, I was working in London, and as was often the case with young female newly qualified barristers, I was given children cases to do. Some of these cases were very distressing. They were quite complex. I was really very surprised that somebody as inexperienced as me in practice of the law might be sent with what we called a brief at court to represent a child, maybe to represent a baby in proceedings. This is prior to a big reform in our childcare law in 1989. So in the 1980s now. But again, that sort of reinforced my feeling that there's so much that is wrong with the way in which society and the law and the justice system is dealing with children and their interests. And then I spent a period of time as a government lawyer from 85 through to 2000. And during that time, I didn't work particularly on children's law. I did a little bit about international reciprocal arrangements for things like abduction of children, so the Hague Convention and implementation and that sort of thing. But I did international work that introduced me to the supranational systems in the Council of Europe and in the United Nations. And I became aware actually in 1989 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We'd been negotiating a treaty on mutual assistance in relation to investigation of crime and the proceeds of crime. And that coincided with the conclusion of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I heard about that and I thought, perhaps I've been in the wrong room here. I wish I'd been in that one. but I was working for the Home Office at the time, and that wasn't my remit. So then, fast forwarding again, when I eventually came back into academia, I had the opportunity to really start to look into child law and children's rights, and that became from 2000 through to now and ongoing my sort of main thing as a researcher and an activist.
I'm getting the impression that you feel that your legal training and at least even the climate in the legal profession was not very conducive to the study of children's rights. Would that be fair?
Yes, and even nowadays, I think it's it's very much an optional or niche area, even here in the UK and even here in Wales, where children's rights have developed a certain prominence in devolved law and policy. So yes, I mean, human rights generally quite suppressed in legal education. We had a big change in the UK, as I'm sure you know, in 1998. 1998, from the 5 years following that, was a very significant period in terms of constitutional reform here, under what was called the New Labour government with Tony Blair. And we had the Human Rights Act. And the point about the Human Rights Act of 1998 was that it brought into domestic law in the UK the requirements of the European Convention on Human Rights. So the UK had been one of the first signatories in 1950, and indeed had been very, very instrumental in the drafting of that convention, but hadn't ratified, and it had ratified, but it hadn't incorporated into domestic law until 1998. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. Resistance of a common law system to the notion of positive rights and the justiciability of some of the rights, resistance to the superiority of an international court. I mean, I think some of these political tropes are probably very familiar to yourself in the United States. But suddenly, what had been, the mantra was that it just wasn't possible in a common law system to have this as part of our law, and suddenly it became inevitable and necessary. So we had the Human Rights Act of 1998, very significant constitutional reform. And at that time, I was working for the Civil Service College, which was the college that provides legal training to government lawyers and also legal, or what we called legal awareness training for administrators, for civil servants. And we did a great deal of work on the implementation of the Human Rights Act before that came into force. So then we got something that was more embedded in our legal system and therefore more reflected in legal education as well. Not really filtering down into education other than for lawyers, however. So yes, underrepresented.
Yeah. Yeah, you've also been involved in development of the Wales Children's Parliament. And that's something that I think our listeners really would like to know a great deal about, because it really is a novel approach, I think, to advocating for children, not only in terms of the law, but also in making the public aware of what their rights are and what childhood really means. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, yes, I can. And I mean, it probably needs a little bit of a broader context, but perhaps we come to that. We use this example of the Children's Parliament, or the Wales Youth Parliament, as it's called, as a way into that. So we have devolution in the UK, again stemming from that period of constitutional change. We had devolution statutes in 1998 that created parliaments and executives for Scotland, for Northern Ireland, for Wales, and for Wales, this sort of got through with a bit of a, maybe a majority of one man and half a dog or something. There wasn't a big swell of public support for devolution in Wales. And there's a different background to it in Northern Ireland with the Troubles, and a different background again in Scotland. So it's asymmetric. These are different devolution arrangements for each of those three parts of the UK. So in Wales, we have devolution, and it's evolved and it's developed and it's grown since then. So the people who were very pro-devolution, the politicians first elected to what was then called the National Assembly for Wales. Now it's called the Senedd, which is Welsh for Parliament. The people who were first elected there were quite an interesting bunch. There was pretty much equal representation of men and women. It was sort of left of centre and continued to be left of centre, and has continued to be left of centre all the way through, although it looks as though big change is coming on that front as well. But a lot of these people had been elected politicians at local government level. A lot of them actually had worked for charities, for NGOs, had been youth workers or youth leaders, teachers, people who came with an inbuilt interest in children, and people who came with an enthusiasm to do things differently in Wales. One of the things they could do differently in Wales was in relation to children. So right from the very early days and the earliest policies and strategies, law reforms coming out of this Welsh devolved setup were things to do with children. And they used the idea of children's rights in a very positive way. And this was reflected in the fact that the Welsh government, as it then was, funded the creation of a children's parliament. They called it the Children and Young People's Parliament, Children and Young People's Assembly for Wales. And in many ways, it mirrored the composition of the National Assembly itself. However, it was a charity. It was an independent body with funding from government. And this went on for some time. And they actually they created quite an interesting model where the young people, this was aged 11 to 25-year-olds, the young people themselves were the trustees of the charity. They prided themselves on it being child-led. In the early days, they had a lot of contacts with what we now call government ministers in cabinet meetings. They conducted research. They developed methods of research that were appropriate for young people, and research reports, and then took their proposals to government, and they were very well received. Yeah. And this went on for some time. Now, then after some years of this, we had a revision of the devolution settlement, and 2006 was the new act, and after that, we had a clearly distinct legislature and government. That hadn't been the case at first. And the logic of this children's parliament idea, to my mind as a lawyer, especially as a public lawyer, would be that it would be associated with the parliamentary side of that equation. It wasn't. It continued to be funded by the executive side, and in what then became a more traditional sort of bilateral between a parliament and a government, more opposition between the two, fulfilling the different roles. It became increasingly uncomfortable for this children's assembly to be part of the government. Fast forward again, by 2012, they'd really fallen out with the government, these young people, and the government was irritated by them. There were noises within the Welsh Parliament side about having a proper youth parliament, and some people were starting to see this children's assembly as ineffective because it was on the government side. And the funding was withdrawn from the charity, and that led in due course to the charity being wound up. Now, that to me, the really interesting thing here was that by this time, these young people and the people who supported them, the trustees, and I became one of the trustees at this point, they had become quite experienced in using the Convention on the Rights of the Child as part of their advocacy. They'd become well aware of their rights. They knew how to make their arguments. They'd also learned research skills. Right? So with the remaining funds that they had, they basically formed a campaign, these young trustees, supported by adults like myself, And they used that UN system. They researched, they commissioned an expert report to make comparisons with other youth parliaments elsewhere in the world. And they made a very, very good report to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, and managed to come back from that process. They actually travelled to Geneva, they made their representations, they were very well received by the UN Committee, and they came back with a recommendation in the form of a concluding observation from the committee that Wales needed to get its act together because it had done very well in some ways on children's rights, but it now really needed a Welsh Youth Parliament. And then from that, the parliamentary side of the constitutional setup here got behind the young people and established from 2018, I think, the Wales Youth Parliament. So this was a success story for children's rights and for those young people in particular. And so the Wales Youth Parliament now is elected for 2-year terms. Again, it's the 11 to 25 age range. Oh, sorry, no, it's not 11 to 25, it's 11 to 18 now. So it is, within the definition of children. And the way that they do the elections is to use pupil identifier numbers. So it's linked to every child. Every child in Wales has a pupil identifier number, whether they're in a private school, a public school, or whatever. And so they do online elections every 2 years, and these young people are returned for that period. They then select their priorities, and they research. Typically they'll conduct surveys. They'll engage with young people as far as possible across Wales, and they will then report. And their reports actually, they're taken seriously. They're taken seriously by the Parliament. They're taken seriously by the government. It's become an established part of the constitutional machinery in Wales. It's non-statutory, but it's serious and it's there. Yeah.
Do you see that model as being transferable or applicable to other settings?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, there are examples of youth parliaments all over the world. And I think that what we've got now in Wales, I mean, we haven't been groundbreaking. We borrowed from what seemed to us to be, the best of the practices elsewhere in the world. If you look at Scandinavian countries, for example, Finland, or a good number of European countries, but elsewhere too. It's something that will inevitably and very properly reflect the constitutional conditions, the social environment, the political environment of whatever country you're talking about. But the key things will be about direct election, independence, and support, and of course, being taken seriously. So in Wales, one of the things I think is very good, and I don't think this necessarily exists everywhere, is that when the young people have their parliamentary meetings, it is in the Senedd, in the chamber, the same chamber that the elected representatives use, and the presiding officer, the sort of chair of those meetings is the presiding officer for the Senedd itself, and conducts those meetings in exactly the same way. Yeah. So I think that's quite important.
Now, one of the great challenges that human rights education has faced is integrating into formal and non-formal education, you might say. Now, you've worked at the University of Swansea and have a children's center there, and I'm wondering if you can talk about how your children's center tends to integrate and or facilitate that transition from concept into practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And this has really been the thing that has been my fascination over the years, this thing that has fascinated me from those various experiences of practicing as a lawyer, as being a government lawyer, and now having that sort of space and time to reflect and to connect with other thinkers, it's how you have a law, and how do you ensure its implementation? And in this case, we may be talking about the international law on the rights of the child, or we might be talking about supportive domestic laws that every country has, protective laws, child protection laws, whatever. How do you actually make it effective in practice, bearing in mind that the people we're concerned with here are, within any society, by definition, the least able to enforce it for themselves. What we have, I will come to our children's centre, but I think it's important to sort of just cycle back a little bit in this context of acceptance, even early on, enthusiasm for children's rights on the part of the politicians in Wales post devolution. We had the opportunity for some key law reforms. Right. So I and one or two other academics, practitioners, NGO actors were able to support a significant law reform, which is called the Rights of Children and Young Persons Wales Act, and that was done it was passed in 2011. And it introduced a legislative concept of due regard. Okay, so it doesn't work in quite the way as our Human Rights Act does. Our Human Rights Act prohibits public bodies from acting incompatibly with the European Convention on Human Rights. This is a gentler form. It's what I call an upstream idea. Is to try to get inside the mind of the decision makers to prevent practices and policies that undermine children's rights from getting instituted in the first place, rather than leaving it to sort of downstream challenges when some abuse has taken place. So this idea of due regard is that the decision maker must have due regard to the requirements of the Convention on the Rights of the Child when exercising their functions, which means any power or duty, which basically means anything that the government does, or the public body under which is under this due regard duty. So that reform was made in 2011. And it's an interesting story of a successful coalition, and a particular time and a particular place when that opportunity happened. But having established that concept of due regard, the question for us then was, well, now what? I mean, how do these civil servants, these ministers, understand what it is they've got to have due regard to, and how do they make that impacts on the decisions that they make on budgets, on education policy, on housing policy, on agricultural policy, transport policy, whatever it's going to be. That requires education, that requires understanding, it requires belief, it requires accountability, it requires a lot of conversation. And so in the university, my colleague, Professor Simon Hoffman and I decided that we would kind of become a focal point for expertise and discussion that could assist in that process. And so we established what we called the Observatory on Human Rights of Children, with no particular funding, but just there's this phrase that's going around at the moment in our media about coalitions of the willing in a very different context. But we were a coalition of those parties from civil society, from public bodies, from academia, who wanted to see this child rights measure make a difference. And in the work of the Observatory, we developed the idea of three interconnected pillars of activity. The first being research, which would include traditional research, which might be about numbers, it might be about the problems that social research tells us that children are encountering, but it would also be research bind with children. So we wanted to, and we did develop mechanisms for doing that, and had some quite striking successes working with children as young as 7 on research projects on matters that they considered important to themselves, helping them to develop coherent arguments and to find decision makers that could help them to implement the changes that they wanted to see. So that was the research idea. And then there's a pillar we call embedding, which means continuing to work on this due regard idea, to embed in administrative and executive practices the consciousness of children's human rights and requirements, build them into processes, requirements, show that you have considered children's rights, show your thinking in the process which leads to this decision. So things like child rights impact assessment, child rights approaches. And then the third column was the accountability. And this is where I have to say this due regard mechanism is a little bit weak, in terms of direct legal accountability. In other words, can you sue somebody for disregard of the requirement? It is a little bit weak. So from that accountability idea, we have developed this Children's Legal Centre for Wales, which has focused so far on public legal education, on legal education for children, and on web-based information for children and people who support them. So there's quite a nice child-friendly and child carer-friendly website with lots and lots of information about the law in Wales as it affects children's sources of support. The ambition of that, which we've got established in about, it was 2018 again that got going. The ambition has always been for it also to work directly with children and those who support them to deliver legal services. But we've never yet been able to establish that within the university for various reasons. That is partly to do with the limitations of the university law clinics in the way that they operate here. So we're very excited very recently to now have spun out the Children's Legal Centre from this activity within the university as an independent charity. And we're just in the process of doing that. And our next 5 years strategy most definitely includes the development as a law centre and a legal practice that would be able to give direct support to children on matters that need to be litigated. or matters on which proper professional practitioner advice is needed. So that's the ambition, and I'm very grateful to the university because they've been extremely supportive of that process. I suppose they regard it as a spin out, and therefore a success. It'll be a spin out that probably never make any money, unlike if it's a piece of kit that's come from some sort of STEM research, but they're proud of it nonetheless. So that's where the Children's Legal Centre idea comes from. It's spawned from the Observatory and now developing in its own right with activity around policy advocacy and strategic litigation. We're already doing that. We're already doing a lot on education and engagement, developing human rights content for curricula and the information, still engaging with students as volunteers from the university, and now we can engage with other universities as well in Wales, but with the ambition to develop as a law practice as well.
So talk a little bit, talk a little bit about the next generation of human rights and children's rights advocates. How do you see them being developed through your work and other people?
Yeah, I think, again, we're fortunate here to have a particular law and policy environment, The rights measure Overall 2011, which I mentioned, is one of the you might say the foundations, perhaps not the foundation, because there was some stuff that preceded it, but it has been followed by other significant reforms in the in public law and public systems in Wales. So I should mention the Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act, which has attracted quite a bit of international attention, I think, which again is something which imposes duties on public bodies to have regard to the well-being of future generations when they are making their decisions. And they've got to prove it. And there's a Future Generations Commissioner. And the Future Generations Commissioner works closely with our Children's Commissioner to ensure that children's rights are integrated into that whole sort of suite of administrative requirements. So again, something doesn't look as though it's got too many teeth, but actually is gradually having quite an impact on the way in which decisions are made by all sorts of public bodies. So we've got that. And then we've had quite recently, after a long period of development and a lot of consultation and input from experts, we've had a fairly wholesale reform of the statutory framework for curriculum for ages 3 to 16 in Wales, which equates to your K something in the States, I think, broadly.
Yeah, I'd say K to 11.
Yeah. Okay, so this is 3 to 16. Well, we've also got an early years strategy, which is very, very child rights focused as well. But this new curriculum is it's kind of a skeleton. It's a values-based curriculum which sets certain aims of education and certain key fields that children in schools have got to engage with, but leaves a lot of discretion to schools and localities to decide exactly how to deliver that and exactly what to do. Human rights education is one of the requirements of that skeleton. There has to be human rights education in there. And the guidance pursuant to this curriculum reform legislation is very, very clearly drawn from the UN guidelines that came out in, I think, 2010 on human rights education itself, as you know, the result of many years of development of the idea of human rights education at international level. So the idea of education about human rights, education through human rights, education for human rights, it's there in the requirements for educators to deliver in schools in Wales for ages 3 to 16. So that's great. That means that there's a statutory backing, a set of statutory requirements within which we can work. What there still is an enormous gap in terms of skills and knowledge and, frankly, belief that this is worthwhile, right? And I think that the skills and the knowledge are the prequel to the belief, because what you don't understand, you tend to dismiss in terms of, well, of course we're kind to children, of course we're nice to our children, of course we want them to get on together, of course we don't want them to be racist, etc., etc. But it takes a depth of knowledge and understanding to realise what strength human rights can bring to your efforts to do that. And then the about human rights, through human rights, the ways in which adult professionals interact with children, teachers in the classroom, and the habits that they have. We talk about participation, we talk about participative, this, that, and the other, but actually doing it properly requires constant self-interrogation, discussion, reflection, and improvement of practice. We've got to, because none of us have been brought up that way. None of us have been, certainly my generation, haven't been brought up with the sort of respect for children and the listening to children that this new approach demands. So that's lacking. That is lacking in initial teacher education. It's lacking in continuous professional development. It's lacking in the conversation. It's actually lacking still in terms of measurement of what a good school is. So it's in that space that we need to be operating, and we are operating by developing sessions, by working with schools and with children and with teachers to create something new and give them the tools to create their own something new to do that will properly implement that idea of human rights education about, through, and for human rights.
Well, that's very positive, I think. Even though there are challenges, the fact that you have an administrative framework and a law in place sets a very positive foundation. And I think that would be a tremendous model to look at in other societies and other countries, because that has really been, in our discussions on this program, a glaring need over and over again.
Yeah. And I think an interesting thing here is that there can be scope to do this. I think in many countries, actually, there is scope to do this below the nation state level. So, in your own case, at state level, at county level, whatever, in local towns, because very, very often the subject of education is something that is, where policy is set and services are delivered at a local level. So in Wales, once we had devolution, we have a different set of requirements in Wales for this 3 to 16 education compared to England, compared to Scotland, compared to Northern Ireland, so that it allows for that flexibility. And I'm aware, just through knowing Yvonne Bissing and the work that she's done at Salem, that, may I say, even in the United States, which is holding out against ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it is possible to find these coalitions of interested, willing people who will experiment at local level, given the powers that they do have. So I think it's important to have that framework and that commitment, that political commitment, to make the space, but it can be done elsewhere, even though the conversation at the top of the tree, at the nation state level, isn't so encouraging.
So one of the most contentious and I think divisive policy issues many countries are facing today is the issue of world migration.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you feel, based on your work with children's rights, national governments should work to safeguard the rights of migrants, particularly children, in a very difficult time.
Yeah, well, obviously the convention regards migrant children, as a category of children in need of special care and assistance. And I think one starts from there, whether the convention is your rule book or not, that's got to be the principle, that these are children in need of special care and assistance and who have a right to special care and assistance. Now, in Wales, there's a push at the moment for a guardianship system for unaccompanied asylum-seeking minors. And the Welsh Government is actively, and I think quite positively, considering that now. So the idea is that there would be a state-funded guardianship system for any child in that category. So that's one part of the jigsaw, and a specific reform that is being campaigned for. More broadly, there's a horrible noise, isn't there, about migration all over the world, and we've got it here. It's becoming quite scary. The intolerance, the rise of what people call nationalism, and we've got some flag waving going on over here at the moment, where people are saying all sorts of crazy things about the impact of migration and what migrants are and what they represent. And that conversation really, really needs to simmer down. So that needs to start with very young children. It needs to start in places where children come together in schools, from the very earliest age. So it's the values, teaching the values of tolerance, human dignity, and some basic information about what it is that is going on and why people are on the move, and how this links to climate change, and how this links to the way the world is organized. So education, I think, is a really key part of dealing with this, and integrating into the classroom the knowledge that is likely to lead to absorption of certain values, of certain attitudes, and an ability to imagine and not be scared of change, which will mean, mixing and integrating and understanding.
I had an interesting conversation with Audrey Osler a while back, dealing with her own personal history, and a fascinating issue brought up about the failure that she felt of her own education in dealing with the impact of colonialism.
Yes, yeah.
How do you see that? How do you see that as impacting the current understanding of minority groups and of the people of different backgrounds in the UK?
Oh, I think it's absolutely huge. And there's at the level of higher education, there's a fair amount of activity around that. I mean, I myself was until recently one of the leads in the university on EDI, and decolonializing the curriculum was a very active, and I think very productive part of it. I've seen some marvelous work done from other universities where they've done this on law. At first blush, I really wondered what decolonializing the curriculum in law might mean. It's the law of England and Wales, isn't it? No, not when you scrape below the surface. Let's think about critical thinking. Let's think about critical legal studies and so forth. And then there's some lovely examples of different approaches to assessment. So even things that I've been involved in. What was it called? The Child Rights Judgment Rewrite Project. So here's the thing: we over a period of years, I and quite a large group of other academics were tasked to identify a reported legal case and rewrite the judgment from a child rights perspective. And we did that, and it was very, very informative. We had some support and some feedback from very senior judges in the UK. And there's a huge tome, a huge volume of these judgment rewrites. This could be an excellent way of assessing within a legal curriculum. I think there's all sorts of possibilities for that. Very important.
So, as we're moving towards the conclusion of our conversation here, I want to ask a few questions that are common for every one of our conversations. And the first one is, who would be the most influential role model for your work in human and children's rights? That could be a person who's here today or has passed.
I'm always inspired by Yvonne. Always inspired by Yvonne. But let me say, somebody I never met and who has passed. I think that when I love to think about the history of children's rights, and it's a kind of centennial thing that I keep reflecting upon now, because it is about 100 years, just over 100 years since the Declaration of Geneva, and what preceded that with the work of Eglantine Jebb and so forth, and all of the new thinking and the peace movement that was emerging at that time. And in some ways, it's actually rather reaffirming to think like that. You think, this is only 100 years old, and it has had a lot of impact. There's so many dreadful things that we hear about and deal with day to day. So my hero in this century of children's rights, Jeb, I think, was marvellous, absolutely marvellous. But my mega hero in the story is Janusz Korczak, who is the Polish paediatrician and educator who, of course, famously died with his children in the gas chambers at Treblinka. But it's his writings that have really moved me, and particularly his notion of respect for children, the right of a child to respect. So whereas Jeb and the background to the Save the Children and those early declarations is hugely important in terms of provision and protection of children. It's this notion of recognition of the child as a human being, and a human being who is a child and has a right to be respected as a child, and to make mistakes as a child, to be heard and to have their privacy and all of that. So I love Korczak's writing, and of course, he's a child rights defender. He's the child rights defender, in my book, and a superhero who made the ultimate sacrifice for his children.
So what quote most effectively sums up your view of the importance of human rights or children's rights, however you want to go?
I think this quote is from Michael Freeman, who is he's died not many years ago, and was a great legal writer in the UK on children's rights. In many ways, a founder of lots of the academic effort in children's rights, and he's the founder of the International Journal on Children's Rights, I believe as well. I think it's him who said that a world that respected children's rights would be a better world for everyone. That, I think, is clearly true.
And so, to conclude, if you had the power to make one critical change in the UK or worldwide to advance the rights of children, what would you recommend?
Well, this might be a bit left of field, but I would encourage all governments to abolish the voting age. I really like the debate around that. I mean abolish, or to recognise children as political actors from birth. Obviously, that gives us a problem about representation. Those problems, some very interesting ideas have been put forward as to how to resolve those problems, whether it's through some sort of institutional representation or through giving parents and guardians the right to exercise a vote until the child is old enough to do so. The reason that I would advocate this is that as long as children don't vote, governments don't have to listen. Elected representatives respond to who's going to vote for them. And that gives older people, especially older people, who tend to be the ones who vote most regularly, it gives them more political clout, political power. So that's it. I would like us to have a serious conversation about abolishing the voting age.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because in Newark, New Jersey, they've just lowered the voting age for the Board of Education, which is interesting because I think that a lot of people view that as almost like a radical idea. But following what you say, it's not radical at all. No,
we're tending to go down. We've got 16 now in Wales, and for some elections elsewhere as well. And there's a proposal for that to be a case of parliamentary elections. No, I mean, I think there's a logic in this argument. I am not pretending that babies in nappies are going to be turning up at polling stations. But there's a truth, a key truth here about political power and representation. And we expect children to obey the law. In the UK, we expect them to obey the criminal law, and they can have the sanctions of the criminal law from the age of 10. Okay? So if they're to obey the law, they're citizens. As soon as they're born, they're recipients of public services. They're citizens. So let's think that through. How is that citizenship represented politically?
Well, if you take it even further, what is the lived experience of a person when they're 11 or 12 years old, and how is that being taken into account by a person who's much older? Are they really thinking about it?
Yeah, exactly. Compared to the demands, maybe very vocal demands, of adult, politically powerful groups and individuals.
Yeah. Well, Jane, this has been a wonderful conversation, and I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have as well.
Yes, I have. It's lovely. Thank you so much for having me. And I've listened to your pod, and I think it's absolutely great. And I'm really, really flattered and delighted that you've asked me to participate in it.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy, that's KRISTI, at hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius-Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Tia Hinz, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.